Hello and welcome to Sync Music Matters, a podcast that explores the beautiful relationship between music and the moving image. My name's Jim Hustrip and I'm your host on this journey, as each week I chew the fat with industry professionals who, on a daily basis, work with music for visuals. Now you might immediately assume that I'm talking about composers, but I'm also talking about editors, music supervisors, directors, and anyone else who's involved with the synchronous process of pairing audio and visuals. Today I'm talking to producer, film editor and post-production specialist Stephen Haren. Hello there and welcome to another episode of Sync Music Matters. Thank you again to AudioSocket ASX for letting me use that piece of music as the opening titles. It's called Dark Arts and was written by me. So what can you expect from today's conversation with Stephen Haren? So Stephen wears a number of different hats. He is both producer, editor and a post-production specialist, so I was very interested to get his take on the application of music in TV and film, in which he has numerous credits. So we go under the skin of his Dark Materials, which is the series based on the Philip Pullman books. He talks about the active role he played in re-temping the series, so that the music had a bit more weight and gravitas to it. He talks about the idea that if the music was too traditional or classical, that it had a tendency to feel a bit too twee. So he was temping it with music from the likes of Trent Reznor, who did Social Network, Marco Beltrami, who did A Quiet Place, but was also using ideas provided by the series composer Lorne Balf. But this is obviously prior to edit. This is a suite of music that Lorne provided before the edit was even finalised. So the idea of temping an episode with the composer's own music. And this is something that we covered in episode 8 with Paulo Pandolpho, who was editor on The Crown. We also go under the skin and talk about the very different approach to soundtracking Northern Soul, which is the Elaine Constantine film starring Steve Coogan. The soundtrack for that was made up entirely of original songs, so it's interesting contrasting those two processes. As with a lot of the interviews that I do, we end up talking about the lack of melody in modern film score. I don't know whether it's me pushing this agenda or it's just a common theme. Could be either. It's something I chatted about with Isabel Waller-Bridge in episode 5 and indeed with Nanita Desai in episode 8. And Nanita cited one of the reasons as being that directors are sometimes reticent to commit emotionally. Stephen has some alternative theories and equally fascinating. So we dig into that. We chat about the pitching process for composers when it comes to major TV series and films, the revealing process of watching audience previews during the production process, and Stephen and I share our love for the epic guitar riffs of the late Dimebag Darrell of the band Pantera. So grab yourself a Viennese swirl, kick back, relax and enjoy this conversation with the wonderful Stephen Haren. Ooh, and one more thing. If you'd be kind enough to pop on over to Apple Podcasts and just leave a quick rating and a review, I would be hugely grateful. It just helps the podcast reach as many people as possible. That's it. Thanks. Bye. Stephen Haren is a producer and film editor with an expertise in post-production and has a variety of award-winning film and TV credits. He's currently producing his Dark Materials Season 3, having been a producer on Season 2, which won 2 BAFTAs for post-production. He was also co-producer and editor on Season 1, for which he received the BAFTA Cymru nomination. Stephen's feature editing credits include BIFFA-nominated Eternal Beauty, Sometimes Always Never, starring Bill Nighy, BAFTA-nominated documentary Kingdom of Us, and BAFTA-nominated indie hit Northern Soul. His television credits include BAFTA-nominated miniseries Mrs. Wilson, starring Ruth Wilson, and Emmy-nominated Black Mirror. Stephen Haren, thanks very much for joining me on Sync Music Matters.
Thanks for having me.
Before we sort of dig into anything, I'm going to sort of start with the first question, which I like to ask every guest, which is if we sort of rewind to a young Stephen gallivanting around the streets of Dublin, if someone had asked you, what would you like to be when you grow up, what would you have replied?
I think originally I wanted to be an author, whatever that meant. I think that was basically based on the fact that I loved Roald Dahl, and I consumed quite a lot of books at that age. Tintin, Asterix, and Roald Dahl were the ones that stick out. So I think that's kind of where I thought I was, if you like. And then by the time I was a teenager, I started I'd always watched a lot of film. My older brother would have shown me an awful lot when I was younger as well, and passed on a fair bit of knowledge and kind of insight. And I think by the time I got into my teenage years, I started kind of moving over that direction, if you like, culminating in getting a camcorder when I was 15, I think, 16, and making some loose documentaries with friends. So that's kind of, by that point, I kind of thought, actually, I wanted to pursue filmmaking. Again, whatever that meant, I didn't really know in concrete terms how you did it.
Sure. And how did it kind of, that distill down? Because obviously filmmaking, large topic, it could have gone directing, it could have gone, well, it did go editing. But what was the sort of process or your process in terms of determining which bit you were most interested in?
I think that, the way that filmmaking is framed culturally, even, when you're growing up at that age without having any, industry connections and any understanding beyond what you've seen and heard of, directing is, posited as the center of it. So that's what everyone hears about. And so initially that was definitely interesting, but I think that, I don't know, I did look into applying to film school, which I didn't pursue. I then went and did a degree at the University of Warwick, in English and film, English lit and film studies, if you like, which was a really good course, but no practical filmmaking. And somewhere through that, I just kind of, I don't know, I kind of, just developed what I felt was my understanding, and my taste and my ability to talk, if you like, which is one of the great skills you get from a degree. And so when I graduated, I didn't really, again, have a very specific aim. I was a little bit loose in that sense. So I moved home for the summer, and tried to find runner jobs, got some work experience in Belfast at different companies, and eventually got a runner job at a good kind of technical company in the West End in London, and moved over, started that job, and that facility, who were kind of quite well regarded at the time, they worked on high-end features that we're shooting at the time, kind of providing technical expertise, if you like. So they were doing, like, at the time, Harry Potter movies and what have you. And that meant that I was quite quickly exposed to kind of high-end filmmaking, not in a creative role, but it meant that I was meeting people very quickly, mostly cutting rooms, editors and assistant editors, the odd line producer, met the odd director, I think. And that kind of exposure felt quite, I don't know, it felt quite natural in a sense, that I seemed to get on quite well with the people that I met, and bit by bit just kind of fell into the idea that the cutting room seemed a kind of graspable way into filmmaking. To me, production, because I didn't have any connection or experience of it, was kind of amorphous and quite hard to grasp at all. I looked into it briefly, but I didn't get very far, to be honest. Whereas something, I was having these immediate relationships with people that were quite fun, and we seemed to be kind of reasonably similar people. And so then that kind of ended up in my first film role as a trainee editor on a feature.
Obviously, you are in production now because you're working on production of His Dark Material Season 3. How did that sort of, as you describe it, amorphous production role that was sort of seemed sort of almost intangible, how did that editorial sort of editing sort of merge into that?
I mean, it came specifically from His Dark Materials. I was on season 1 as an editor, kind of quite late in the process after the shoot. So trying to kind of help bring it together alongside the other editors. And I kind of naturally, and with no kind of plan, started taking a slightly more leadership role within it. And then the exec producer, Jane Tranter, who's the boss of the production company, Bad Wolf, said to me, do you want to carry on with us once editing is finished and help us with the rest of post-production, which would mean sound, music, the grade and what have you, up to get the show delivered. It was a very complex show to deliver. So because I had a lot of all these post-production skills, if you like, and a lot of experience from kind of higher end stuff, or equally high end, let's say, it meant that I fell quite naturally into it. Again, it was quite easy. I found it quite easy. It was it was very hard work, but I just understood what needed to be done, if you like. And then that led into season 2, where I went back as a producer. Again, the shoot was actually over, so I solely my first stage of that was working with the editors that they had. I didn't do any editing on it. Worked with the editors to get the cut into shape. Obviously, I had a certain take on how the show needed to be told and put together, and worked with those editors, and then carried on the rest of the process as I had on season 1 to the end. And then season 3, because there was a little time gap, I was able to come back much earlier and come back in pre-prep and actually feed into script development, let's say, with the knowledge and understanding that had built up about the show specifically over 2 seasons, and hopefully learning from some of the mistakes we'd made and what have you, and what we could make better and how we could make it play and avoid just some of the pitfalls that I felt we had fallen into a few times. So that meant just kind of feeding in from the ground up, if you like, rather than, as someone put it, picking up the broken plates at the end of the process. So I was there to try to catch the plates as they fell, if you like.
Yeah, okay. And just for anyone listening who kind of, because I think it can obviously vary, but how would you sort of describe the role of producer? And then also, I mean, and is your production role sort of specifically tied to the post-production part of it?
That's like a primary concern, but I guess the more highfalutin way to put it on season 3 is that because I'm so inclined toward the storytelling of the show, it means that I'm looking at story and the storytelling of the show from the point of view of script, cast, direction, photography, and just trying to see it holistically, which I think is the holistic approach is something that I think is, very much comes from an editing background. Directors obviously have it too, producers have it as well, clearly. But as an editor, it's something, in my experience anyway, was something that I was always trying to bring and look at the bigger picture. I think I've got an ability to kind of look at detail in minute detail, but also pull back and see where we need to go.
Well, that's interesting, because interviewed Michael Price as well, and we were also talking about that ability to sort of focus in on the micro detail, but also be able to stand back and sort of see the bigger picture. And actually, certainly as composers, sometimes the collaborative nature of working with editors or producers or execs, whoever it is, that they sometimes provide the perspective for the creatives who are sort of maybe so deep in the weeds that they've sort of lost track of it. Yeah,
I think it only comes from experience. I mean, some people might have that as a natural skill. It took me a while to develop it, but it's something that I find quite easy.
And was it also that case when you were sort of, as an editor, were you able to sort of see those two different?
I think it probably took me a while to develop it. I think I might have begun off thinking that everything is in detail, that everything, which is, is partly true, but you only work out the significance of the detail by pulling back. So I think it took a while, and it probably, when you're doing a film, what's quite interesting and specific to filmmaking, feature filmmaking as opposed to TV, is that you, depending on the budget and depending on the appetite for it, you very often have to watch the film with an audience. That might mean that you preview it at an early stage, or certainly means that if you're like I was, I would go see things that I worked on in the cinema with an audience after they'd come out, just again, sometimes could be months and a year after you'd finished it, just because I've always been fascinated by people's responses. Which again is a helpful thing to be interested in when you're editing. And I think that that experience of knowing, or at least honing your instinct on when things tend to work and not work for audiences, what things from my history work and don't work. I try to feed that into everything I do, but you very, very rarely, if ever, have that experience on TV. It's more bubble-like in that sense, which has its pros, but I think is also actually a flaw in the process.
Yeah. And does the way in which you view the finished product with an audience simply change the way that you're viewing it as well, knowing that you're in an auditorium full of people who are viewing it?
Yeah, your anxieties, especially when you're mid-process, like before it's finished. Your anxieties about all the things that you think aren't good or don't work or that you're concerned about or whatever it is, or I'm sure as well the things that you feel confident in suddenly get kind of knifed by a lack of response in the room. You can just feel it in the temperature. Quite literally, you can sense it. You know, if you're doing a preview, as I did a fair few of them with an audience of 200 people in the UK or the US, you very, very quickly know whether the film's working or not. And that exposure, it's very brutal. But that exposure to that process, I think, is invaluable, and I wish they did it in TV, to be honest. I understand why they don't. And then the other thing that you learn from it, which I think is really, really useful, is how you choose as filmmakers to interpret that response. They might feel that the first 10 minutes, you know, in terms of the things that they often feed back on, you know, let's say they fill in a questionnaire, they do a Q&A at the end, recurring things tend to come up regardless of the film. Usually it's the first 10, 15 minutes are too slow, right. Or, you know, I think the middle sags, that kind of thing. And all of that is really useful. And then you just have to decide, well, does that really matter? Or is that something that actually is a true problem? Because, there's a difference between really deep problems that are worth solving and relatively deep problems that you actually need to leave well alone and just move on, because you can't fix everything.
Yeah. I suppose you have to be discerning in that interest, because creating by committee, I sort of find this so I run a team of writers for a production library, and you quickly realise that if you play a piece of music to 5 different people, each 5 of those people will have ideas about what they would change, and they're not always exactly the same. So in that instance, you're sort of playing it to an audience of multiple people who all may have opinions on it, but you also have to have the sort of, I suppose, conviction to go, okay, some of that you're going to take, some of that you're going to leave, and you have to also rely on, I suppose, your own judgment, because otherwise...
I think, one of the things you have to develop as an editor, and which I think I bring into the producing role, is you get a very clear, strong sense of your own taste. And, my taste as such, it doesn't apply in rough terms to all things equally. It's about how I apply my taste and my sense of storytelling, or my sense of what I think is good, to each individual thing. And I try to do it in a reasonably non-prejudicial way. I might have worked on films that weren't necessarily exactly my type of film, but I'll try and, I hope, contribute a kind of thought process that helps make it as good as it can be, rather than just making it what I want it to be.
Yes. Yeah. Okay. And I suppose again that ties into that sort of being able to sort of see the bigger picture and step back and have that kind of that macro overview. And just as well, you mentioned sort of like quite often that people sort of say that the first 10, 15 minutes are a bit slow. Obviously, we live in an age where apparently people's attention spans are getting shorter.
As is mine.
Is that something you sort of have to factor in now that you maybe didn't 20 years ago?
I think, to be honest, 20 years ago, the first 10, 15 minutes of a lot of films were too fast, because they probably listened to that note too much.
Right, okay.
So I think I remember even at the time, even some of the films I'm thinking of I was working on more as an assistant, I saw what happened to the first 10 minutes, 20 minutes because of that note, and it wasn't good. So I think, it's why you often find that it's still the case, I'm sure. It's hard to think of examples, but that films just kind of rush through their premise just so they can just get to the point where it becomes interesting, whether that's the arrival of the main antagonist or whatever it is, or the bomb going off. I don't know. So it's funny. I think the streaming thing is I'm sure is making it worse. And I have to admit, I find it quite difficult not to stick through something for its duration, but I actually find it quite hard to stick through an awful lot of things past episode 1, but because I just don't find them very interesting. But that's just taste as well. But I think it's really tricky. But when you're doing TV, I had to very quickly get used to a new version of that, which was to do with, for example, well, what are we doing before the title sequence? How do you draw people in before the titles? And that's like kind of almost the recurring thing. And then how do we leave them at the very, very end to bring them back? So it's a quite a different set of challenges, if you like, but like not dissimilar to feature filmmaking.
Yeah. And it's interesting you mentioned that as well, because one of my guests, Andrew Stannard, we were talking about sort of melody in music, and that sort of in the 80s and possibly into the 90s, melody was much more sort of prevalent, certainly in sort of TV and film scores. You think back to the 80s, there's so many incredible TV programs which had these amazing sort of theme tunes. Perhaps see it, I don't know, less now, but maybe it is coming back. I think it's disappeared. A lot of melodic composing, I'll be honest. Yeah. So Andrew posited the theory that one of the reasons, and I think this was something that Daniel Pemberton had talked about, I can't remember, but it was the idea that back in the day, you sort of had this long sort of title sequence with some great music, because you couldn't just tune in and watch it whenever. It was sort of like appointments of view. So it was almost like you had the music to sort of get people ready, like, oh, okay, let's get ready. And so everyone would sort of sit down and watch it. Yeah. Is that kind of still part and parcel of the sort of title sequence? Because you mentioned what's happening before the title and then the title sequences, and you see increasingly sort of on Netflix the sort of more elaborate sort of CGI'd sort of title sequences with quite often commercial music. What role does that play in your mind in terms of capturing people's attention and sort of leaving a lasting impression?
Well, on His Dark Materials, we have an exceedingly expensive 90-second title sequence that we all want everyone to sit through, and to which Lorne did a great theme. But it's depressing to me that people might be speeding through it. But I'm a bit old-fashioned. I mean, I watch end credits, so what can I say? Like, I don't skip through anything. I watch the whole thing from start to finish. Not always to episode 2, but I try to give episode 1 a go.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, well, I think it's part and parcel of setting the scene, isn't it? And sort of it's a statement of what's to come in many ways. Awesome. Well, I think it's probably a good time to sort of go under the skin. Under the skin. So His Dark Materials. Interesting angle here, because obviously on the first season you were involved as an editor, and on the sort of second and third you're sort of involved in more of a sort of production capacity. I'm kind of interested in how, obviously you touched on sort of how the roles are sort of different, but in terms of on the first series, when you're working with Lorne on the music, and presumably the music was already starting, because you came in to sort of finish up, didn't you? You weren't starting from the basis. But
yeah, it was at a curious kind of point, which was that the execs were talking to Lorne and liked him a lot, and he had put together some suites, some kind of thematic character material. I can't quite remember how many, quite a lot actually, to give a sense of what he thought was the sound, and where he could go with it. So that kind of existed in the background when I started, but actually what was the process I was getting into, which was re-editing, to try and kind of improve it and bring it forward. One of the things that was part of that, from my point of view, was to re-temp score it. So I had a music editor who did some of it, and then I did whatever other proportion as I was recutting myself, just kind of independently. And that wasn't really based on any conversations, creative conversations I'd had with execs. That was just more to do with what personally I felt was lacking in the temp that they had, and where I thought it should go to make sense of it and to make it basically more enjoyable to watch.
And can you touch on what you did think was missing from the temp?
Now, I've been thinking about this the last few days, trying to remember about what was it, and it all exists on some hard drives in Cardiff, which we could double check. So basically, there were kind of a few pitfalls that you could fall into on the show, which at that time, maybe was the case. If you scored it with something that felt reasonably classical, by that I mean that's a hard word to define, actually, isn't it? If you were to do something that was seemingly like a little bit overly fantasy, or a little bit overly lyrical. Again, these aren't great adjectives. You could end up making the show feel very twee and cute and not serious and grown up enough very quickly. And so you couldn't really take a Harry Potter score, which works great for Harry Potter, and put it on this, because it just, what it would do was kind of dangerous, I felt. I forget, there was a lot of music that I regard as very, very good music on there. You know, there were things like originally a lot of Alexandre Desplat scores, which are fantastic scores in their own right for the films that they're written for. But when put on the show, began to kind of make it too easy, too cute, too light, weirdly. So I would have put, I forget what a lot of it was, but some of the things I did put on were things like kind of the reasonably, I feel, the opposite. So things like put a bunch of stuff from A Quiet Place on it for suspenseful sequences, which was a kind of modern sound, quite meaty, and kind of very, I mean, a bit drony, which is not where Lorne goes. When you talk about melody, you know, he's much more of a melodic composer. But it may be a little bit more drony than we ended up, let's say. But it kind of had a feel that made it feel serious, and gave it just a bit of heft, which it just needed. It needed weight. Weirdly, to move it forward and push it forward story-wise, weirdly, it needed more weight. Not to make it more meaningful, but by literal, like, sound, audible weight, like a kind of thick sound. And I'm trying to remember what some of the other things I put on it were. I put on bits from a couple of bits that I thought worked quite well, like The Grey, Mark Streitenfeld score. You know, some of these scores which are, you know, do, as I say, do get a bit drony, but they just kind of gave it what I felt was like a kind of a seriousness and a maturity that helped it move forward, and wasn't too afraid of getting scary when it needed to be scary, let's say. Things like that. Not that there's lots of that in the show, but there's, you know, elements of that. Struggling to remember what some of the other bits were, but anyway. And I put a bit from Logan on it, I remember as well. Some kind of recurring pieces from Logan. And then we were kind of editing along. The recuts kind of were going down quite well, and the rescoring was getting received quite well, seemed to be kind of supporting the direction, if you like. And then around the same time, we started sitting with Lorne and started spotting, and bit by bit trying to build up the sound. And, you know, he brings very naturally a very modern, confident sound to it. It's not, I think that confidence in melody and in, like, the way that melody gets used is really, really useful for the show. Like, it gives it, the show at all times, when it's having trouble, it needs propulsion, and Lorne provides that in abundance.
And when you say as well, so you're talking about you were picking cues for the temp, which you felt were actually sort of, by virtue, were actually sort of slightly more drony. Did Lorne take those and take it out of the realm of drone, or was there kind of still an element of that? Because this is something, you know, drone is much more prevalent, and I've talked about this with Isabel Waller-Bridge and Anita Desai, in that, and we, you know, you mentioned as well that melody's gone because actually quite often it's very much sort of like,
wow. Yeah.
Oh, I'm going to sample that. I might use it.
Yeah, please.
So is that something that you sort of deliberately wanted to sort of step away from, or is that still kind of in there?
I think Lorne does, you know, in his own work and other scores, I think it's fair to say that, you know, he does use a bit of it, but it tends to be very melodically driven. So there are probably little pieces in there, and he used, like, he made certain instrument choices that kind of lent itself to that. He doesn't tend to be overly sound designy, as I would put it, which I think is great, because apart from the fact that the sound design on the show is something separate and you know, just as valuable and done by a separate group of people, you know, it doesn't want to counter that too much. I think what he immediately brought was incredibly memorable melodies, and that were character led, particularly sometimes theme led, as in the thematics of what was going on. But it was the fact that they were character led. So every character, pretty much, or all the main characters anyway, had a group of people had a particular theme. Many of which I can practically hum now, if you like, just because they're all earworms. You know, he's extraordinary. I remember there's one theme that he brought in, which is it's the end of episode 5, when Lyra arrives in Bolvangar, which is one of the key kind of locations of the first book. It's one of the best in the show as well, I think. And there was a quite a spare, ominous melody that he put as the first cue to introduce you into that environment. And I listened to it on a Friday, the very first time it had been sent over as a prospective cue, and I couldn't get it out of my head for days and days and days. And I've spent the last 2 years trying to work out a way to get it back into the show, just because it's just incredibly good.
Yeah. So Nonita Desai, one of her sort of theories on why melody is less prevalent in modern score is because directors kind of sit on the fence emotionally. Is that something you would subscribe to, or have you got an alternative theory?
I think I could think of a bunch of reasons. I think one of the reasons is that might be true, that there's a kind of, I mean that said, I can think of a few composers. Desplat is like an obvious example to me. He's really melodic and beautiful melodies, and quite diverse in the way he uses them. I think one of the reasons things have gone that way is a lot of drama, TV and film, has become heavily reliant on its scoring. And if you've got a whole load of score running through everything, it's very, very hard to sneak in melodies as often as you might like. And also, you might be in a situation, as sometimes you often are, which is that you're heavily editing those cues, and you might be heavily re-editing picture, which means at a certain point it's very, very hard. It's even harder to get melody in. I think it's also just kind of its approach, though, isn't it? And also, like, I think of another reason, which is that a lot of filmmaking. This is incredibly generalizing. A lot of filmmaking, though, on TV and in cinema now, doesn't tend to take too much of a respite from dialogue. And if you're not taking a moment to look at a vista, or the traditional places where you might think that melody historically can go on a film, again, you're not going to be able to sneak much of it in. And the art of underscoring dialogue, let's say, which was probably one of my favorite things, really, in terms of subtle scoring beneath scenes, maybe also starts to fall away because maybe directors or producers aren't really thinking of the importance of it, or aren't looking for it. They're just looking for a tonal identity, and sometimes all of these things are being done so quickly that, well, how much time do you have to create a memorable melody? An example of that, which I have very mixed feelings about, both very positive and reasonably negative, is the way that David Fincher's films have been scored for a number of years now, since like Social Network onwards. In other words, when he started working with Trent Reznor, whose work I love, and I'm a big Nine Inch Nails fan, way previous to that, I don't really, and I've used a lot of that stuff for temp, I'll be honest. I've used it because it's really easy to use a temp, because you can just stick it on stuff and re-edit it, and it's quite straightforward, even though it's tonally complex and what have you. But I don't personally regard it as really, really interesting scoring. It's more like akin to sound design. And I think as that type of music starts to infiltrate really good filmmaking, really good filmmaking, Mindhunter is another example of it. It's tonal. Like, I couldn't tell you I can remember the theme to Mindhunter, but I can't remember any other themes within it. It's more about atmosphere and tone. And I think ultimately, this is, again, so simplistic, but if you're a filmmaker and you're making a moody crime show, you're probably going to look at Mindhunter and go, well, that worked really well, didn't it? Which it did. It was great. Well, maybe let's just stick some moody, like, dum, 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 underneath everything, It's tricky. But I come from I'm an age, if you like, whereby, I grew up listening to much more classical scoring, including a lot of the things I would have loved when I was young. I couldn't name you a single theme from a Marvel movie. It's partly because I haven't really watched most of them, I'll be honest. But the ones I have watched, I found turgid. But that's just my age and taste. But anyway, I don't think that the approach to scoring in those films is, let's say, as interesting or memorable as their equivalent in the 70s, 80s, 90s.
Well, yeah, you're certainly not alone in having that opinion.
I feel comforted by that.
It's definitely, I think, a lot of people miss. And I don't know, I'm hopeful that one day sort of Melody will come back with a...
Lorne will give it a try. Lorne will try.
Yeah, absolutely. He'll advocate that. So in terms of your process from series 1 of his Dark Materials to kind of now where you're not hands-on editing, but you're sort of producing, obviously your role has changed in terms of music, in terms of you're not making decisions about temp score, or are you? I mean, have you been involved in the sort of temp scoring process?
Yeah, I mean, I would, on season 3, let's say, the editors, I think we had 5 editors, who are all very good and all very good at temp scoring, actually. Yeah, if I felt that there was something that wasn't quite right for a sequence or a section, or that was, either that was the use of an old Lorne cue or something brand new that they were bringing from somewhere else, if I felt it wasn't right, then yeah, I would get it changed, because I know tonally where it sits, and I also know what it's going to need, roughly speaking, before we get into all the specifics with Lorne. So yeah, no, I would definitely, I was managing that a reasonable amount, but the editors are actually all very good at it, and we're bringing really strong ideas.
And in terms of the sort of you do the spotting session with Lorne. Lorne sort of sends over ideas for cues. How many sort of people are kind of involved in the decision-making process of that? Is it are you sort of like a first port of call and sort of like a gatekeeper, and then thereafter people can have an opinion, or how does it work?
Oh yeah, no, everyone's got an opinion, don't they? Yeah.
Well, yeah.
There's no lack of opinions around.
No.
So I kind of, my process as it stands is I'm first port of call, working with a music editor called Al Green, who helps kind of manage everything, and we've listened to Lorne's process. Is really interesting. It's not something I'd encountered before, which is that he has written and put together incredibly high quality production value versions of suites, like a massive range of suites, which kind of relate to characters or moods or that type of thing. So we had started receiving that stuff, which were kind of reasonably broad stroke pieces of music, if you like, that go through all sorts of kind of minors and majors, small and large. We started receiving those while we're editing. So as we were shooting and editing, we were peppering things in, like where it felt as a good way to kind of diversify the palette, if you like, but keep it within Lorne's world. So then we kind of, for example, he might have sent over a bunch of suites for, Lord Asriel, James McAvoy's character. But actually what we've, found, or what the editors found as they started putting it in, was, actually that piece of music is terrific for a totally different character at this point. So it's not so obviously black and white when you start putting it in. But that means that by the time you get to the finishing of editing and the beginning of spotting, which is the process we're in at the moment, you've got quite a reasonable amount of that new stuff in there, alongside more historic cues and alongside completely left field cues from elsewhere. And then we spot it, and then we go through a process where bit by bit each episode in episodic order gets built up cue by cue by cue. We kind of, based on the temp, we kind of know where we want music, and we have given notes on where we think it needs to go, kind of thing, and where it might fit holistically across the season in terms of the characters and what have you. And then by the time we've got, let's say, an episode which is, I feel, in good order, which might have taken a couple of passes to get it into a place, I then play it to the execs. There's 2 execs, Dan and Jane. And then they feed in, and their feeding back tends to be reasonably specific and minimal, but very helpful. and then we're off and running, and then we move on to the next one, and Lorne has to get recording. So it's all done in episode order. It's all pretty heavily managed, if you like, and I don't know. I think it's an incredibly productive process, and I think what Lorne gives us in terms of production value is just kind of extraordinary in terms of when it really works, how it lifts the picture, which is what I'm always after. Like, how can we elevate it and escalate it?
Yeah, absolutely. In terms of, because you mentioned there you got 2 execs, does that kind of decision making process become increasingly more complicated the more execs are involved?
Yeah, I mean, on a season 1, there's a bit of that. It took a while to land at a place as we were scoring where everyone was comfortable in the process and comfortable with what they felt was coming out of the process. Is this the direction we're heading because the clock is ticking, kind of thing. By season 3, it's pretty fluid. And the thing obviously doesn't really necessarily apply to the show, but applies to everything else as well, is that talking about music, as you would know very well, I'm sure, is incredibly difficult. And how you express what you think might be a problem or where you think it should go is pretty fragile ground. And as it's exactly the same with an edit, to be honest. People don't often know how to talk about editing. So it's not dissimilar. But the problem with music is it's musical. So it's just, it's in a realm of expertise and kind of training even that most of us on the show don't have.
But it sounds like you've got quite a good handle on how to talk about music, do you?
Don't know what Lorne would say about that. but I come from a point of view of tone, the characters, the story, the pacing. How should it make us feel? One of the things that happens during scoring is that you kind of there's obviously a few downsides that can happen during temp. One of them is that you've papered it with so much temp to get you through a whole set of problems that you have inherent in the story or whatever it is, or in the sequence. And then you come back to scoring it and you're faced with all the same problems again. And it's like, oh God, how on earth are we going to solve this one? Or sometimes, because temp is temp, it's not always hitting, rarely ever hitting every single thing you'd really like it to hit. So then when you get into scoring, you suddenly reveal a whole load of other things that you need to be acknowledging or playing to. So I don't know. I love the process. It's probably it's up there with my most enjoyable processes on the show for sure. And I always loved it in previous films or what have you.
You mentioned as well, Lorne, how what he does is so good in terms of lifting the visual. What's the process with something like His Dark Materials of deciding, picking a composer? Presumably there's a sort of shortlist and a pitching process. Yeah,
it exists. It had happened previous to me joining, but I have been in on that process multiple times and other things. But yeah, they had before I joined, they had met a number of composers, all of whom were kind of interesting in their own regard for sure, and who had sent in. I don't know, suites, I guess is the only way I can put it, kind of demos, if you like, which is obviously really tricky because, and I'm actually not even sure I listened to many of the previous ones. But, Lorne was just very obviously was bringing the goods, especially in production value terms, which is kind of priceless, quite literally. But, kind of extraordinary. But yeah, I've definitely been involved in some reasonably tortuous kind of decision making around composer hires in the past, and I wouldn't even go into it. It's kind of but ultimately it becomes what is it that you want? What is it? What's the personality of the composer, and how are they going to fit into this process, and how willing are they to be part of it? What do they think of the temp? Actually, is a really interesting one. I rarely ever worked on anything that didn't have temp, if you liked, and the temp was usually pretty well worked out, if you like. Again, but obviously needed to be improved. And I'm definitely not of the mind that the temp just needs to be matched. You know, I always would want to raise it to the next level, particularly in terms of how you give something identity. You know, because I've had experiences in the past where I'd heavily temped something, and I'd had to heavily temp it with a range of different types of things in order to operate a number of different gears in the drama, by which I mean you might have had some slightly more old-fashioned sounding score versus some more modern score versus, as probably happened to me a few times. And that was because, from my point of view, and I think it's difficult for a composer though, but from my point of view, it wasn't about the sound per se. It was about, let's say, what that piece of music was kind of producing or emphasizing, let's say, at that moment in the film. But then it's difficult for a composer, because the composer's like, well, why the hell have you used, you know, James Newton Howard, Trent Reznor, and, you know, Louis Armstrong? I don't know, you know, and it's just a kind of bizarre thing. But it's like, no, that's not what, you know, I've had those conversations. It's not quite what we were after. We need the composer to bring the holistic kind of unified approach.
And I think in that instance, that's where the composer needs to sort of read between the lines and sort of understand that it's like, I'm not looking for a sort of a pastiche of every different genre under the sun. But,
and I have, and gosh, I have had processes where you do end up with a pastiche and it's not enjoyable.
No,
it was not desired. It was not desired, and it was unfortunately, that's what happened.
But if nothing else, for just having a sort of like of just comedic impact of what happens when someone delivers a pastiche.
Oh boy! Yeah.
Unless, of course, you're on major deadline. It's like, oh god, what is this? But
it's happened. Yeah, it has happened.
Yeah. And I'd quite like to touch on Northern Soul as well, because obviously with His Dark Materials, it's slightly more the traditional process of film scoring, composers working to picture, spotting, etc., etc. Northern Soul, much more, or is it entirely soundtrack? Was there any composition on? Is it?
It's all commercial tracks, and but it was supposed to have a score. There was a composer hired for it. So when I joined, Elaine Constantine, the writer-director, is very much her project through and through. She'd been developing it for years. She knew exactly what she wanted it to be, or wanted it to feel like. It's probably the best way to put it. And they had, because it was limited budget, they had got a music supervisor called Gary Welch, who's terrific, to pre-clear, research, all the rest of it, find the masters of... Off the top of my head, it was something like 30 songs. I can't quite remember, but there were 30 songs, let's say, that Elaine really, really adored and felt was right for the film. And she has an encyclopedic knowledge of that whole world, which I don't. I was coming at it from a different point of view, if you like, just for the film's sake, if you like. But she's very embedded in the culture. And but there was a composer, and what happened was I was on the shoot editing as we were shooting, and I had this, let's say, 30 songs that I've been given, which is, you know, certainly a rarity. I mean, I've never been in that position before since, and some of the sequences would have been written with a song in mind, and there were some songs that were specific to a scene just because it was part of the story. But beyond that, I did have a lot of freedom in how to use them, and I kind of probably quite quickly during the shoot, and I was therefore seeing Elaine every day, at the end of every day, I went beyond what was necessarily in the script quite quickly. So let's say I used the song and elaborated it across a kind of whole section that wasn't really the thought process. And all the while through that, and this is really only the shoot, which was only a 5-week period, all the while through it, we're talking about scoring. And I remember putting together a scene, I forget which one it was. I think it might have been the opening, actually, with the main characters walking down his street. I put on a bit of temp, which I recall was something like maybe a Dickon Hinchliffe cue, like a Tindersticks cue or something. I can't quite remember. Something kind of reasonably moody, melodic, quite interesting, which I felt was kind of good for that moment. And Elaine had an abject reaction to it immediately. And I just, hit stop, hit delete.
Yeah, that was a mistake. Yeah, I don't know how did that get in there?
And that was because she had a very specific score in mind, which was she wanted the score to be like a score from the 60s of a kitchen sink drama. It's like a Johnny Dankworth type score, like, in other words, jazz inflected score, which I, in the back of my head, felt was absolutely wrong. But of course, I was going along with it, going, okay, well, geez, let's see how this develops. But that sounds like a terrible idea. And so then I put on something that was anti that, which she absolutely hated. So that ended that conversation. And then I kind of parked that chat. Bit by bit, though, what you're doing is, as you put the film together, as it starts getting longer and longer, quite literally, it's got a hell of a lot of songs in it. And we watched the film, the first cut, which was, I think that the final film ended up being 100 minutes, but the first cut was like 2 hours 40, so it was like an hour longer. And we sat and watched it on like day one of post, just me and her. Went for lunch afterwards, and it was just the songs. And I'd removed, there was no temp scoring at all in it. But there was space, you could have put temp in it. And we went for lunch afterwards, and I said, thinking, I'm not sure how this is going to go down. I said, we shouldn't have any score. It's going to clash too much with the style of the songs. We'll never get it right. It'll kill it. It'll smother it. It's got to be about the songs, because that's what the story's about. And instantaneously she was like, yeah, you're right. Okay. And that was it. We moved on, so that we didn't talk about scoring ever again. So then it became about how the songs are used, how they feel in the rooms. And we tried all sorts of those different tracks in different places and what have you, and then came up with where we ended up.
Yeah. And in terms of selection of those tracks and what's driving where they're placed, how much of it is driven by lyrical content and how much of it is driven purely by the mood and feel of the music?
It was mostly mood and feel. I mean, beyond the two or three that form a part of the story, there's one song in particular that forms a recurring part of the story. It's a track that they're trying to find a copy of. Lyrically, like, for example, you just find it was all kind of happy accident stuff. Some stuff just sits really well, and some of it feels anti, and sometimes the counterpoint is good. I mean, one of the songs actually that was in the original selection, I'm pretty sure, but which was not Northern Soul in genre, was a Brand New Key by Melanie, which was like a number 1 or top 10 hit at the time, 1972, I think it's or 71. And to Elaine's amazement, this song was supposed to play in the background of a scene. I think that's what it was intended for. And to her amazement, I stuck it on the front title sequence, which is completely anti what at first glance what the film is about. But actually that was exactly the point, because I wanted to make a statement at the front, which was the world in which the protagonist lives in. This is what he hears. And in 5 to 10 minutes later, he's going to hear something that's completely different. So I felt that it played into the environment and the time. But I think she came out in a rash every time she heard it. But it kind of, it fulfilled a kind of major story point, I felt. And she felt, I think, as well.
Getting a taste. I always feel that a lot of our creative decisions are driven by what we've been exposed to creatively, whether from an artistic or musical point of view throughout our lives. Are there sort of specific kind of seminal pieces of music, seminal albums, seminal artists that you can pick out from sort of your usually more formative years, which you think have gone a long way to informing how you hear music and how you implement it in productions today?
I think that, for sure. I think that it's difficult because I don't have my own taste, let's say, and I've built up, my own kind of range of favorites or what have you, which are, none of which are particularly kind of groundbreaking, different from anyone else. I think that, but I don't listen to a lot of film scores. I only listen to film scores when they're on films. And if I find them interesting, I make a note of them or what have you. But I listen to a lot of commercial music. That's what I listen to. I think that the kind of, I'm not a fan of pastiche at all. Like, I'm a really anti-pastiche person. I don't know why. And I'm happy enough with making a nod to something that's saying something I'm making, but I do not want to replicate something that's been done before if I can possibly avoid it, unless it's a very, very interesting reference. But so so like, let's say the films that, you know, were formative would be things like, you know, The Good, the Bad and the Ugly. I mean, this is quite, I'm just thinking through the 80s. Hitchcock movies, Psycho is the first one I remember clearly. Bernard Herrmann, Taxi Driver, Die Hard. I got into Polanski movies, all this stuff. I don't really think there's a simple way to connect any of that. I don't think with anything that I've worked on in any specific way. I mean, apart from that, I find them all really satisfying. And, you know, I do think that the use of, for example, I do think the scoring in Die Hard is quite exceptional. I think the way that the counterpoints the picture and the use of melody is extraordinary and all the rest of it. All these things made a massive impression. I'm not sure that I very rarely, I mean, this is the way I see it. Of course, I might be missing something. I very rarely, when I'm working on something, watch it and go, yeah, you know what, we should really do a Die Hard here. You know, it's kind of like, I don't see it in those terms. And then in terms of like commercial music, like, I don't know, you know, I spent my teens thinking that the Stones were it, and then I got into my 20s and I thought, actually, no, the Beatles are it, aren't they? and I haven't really, I keep kind of dipping in and out of them for the last couple of decades. And then, like, I don't know, I like a lot of jazz and a lot of hip hop and kind of a lot of soul. And I don't know, I like really strong melody music for sure. There's no doubt about that. But if I think about like things I've worked on, and that's why, you know, something like Northern Soul was so much fun for me, because I grew to love the music so much. I didn't know a lot of it before, for sure, but I really fell in love with it. I despite all of that and having a love for a melody and what have you, or an earworm, and there's plenty of things I'm worked on, I'm sure, where I think the style of the composer or the style of the piece didn't totally lend itself to that kind of approach. So, you know, where something in Start Materials does. So I don't think I bring too many preconceptions, I hope, to the things I'm working on. I try to kind of react to what they are in the moment. Yeah.
Is there a piece of music or an album that you think when you first heard it sort of made you stop and go, whoa, hold the phone, what is that? It's just revolutionised your world?
The first thing that comes to mind is not that cool.
Go on then.
Right.
Is it MC Hammer?
I wish. No, I wasn't cool enough for that. It was about a year or two after that I was starting to buy music. So I'd had a couple of albums bought, when, you know, given to me as Christmas presents. I think I'd had a couple of Beatles best ofs bought for me Christmas by my brother, I think. And so I'd, you know, learned some of that, or, you know, got used to some of it, but I wasn't really listening to it by the time I was 12 or 13 per se. But then by the time I got into when I was 14, for some reason, and I have no regrets because I still listen to them over and over, I really got into gangster rap, and I still am. And then at the same time, I started getting into the metal of the day. And when you say that hold the phone, I definitely wasn't on the phone, but it's the first track of a Pantera album, who are not a band that have gone down in history, perhaps, with, you know, broadly.
Vulgar Display of Power?
Vulgar Display of Power, Mouth for War, yeah, the first song. I remember pressing play on it. I had a cassette, bought the second-hand cassette, and I remember I bought it from the second-hand shop in Belfast after school. Friends of mine listened to it, and I had never heard it before, and it wasn't on the charts, let's say, and it wasn't in the hit parade. And I went out and bought Vulgar Display of Power, this old cassette that absolutely stank of cigarettes. It was rank, and it's awful. It made me want to throw up. And press play on it, and I swear I heard the opening riff the first 30 seconds. I had to stop and rewind it and listen to it again, and that was like the groove of it. There's something about the groove and the weight of it was just like, oh God, I could listen to that right now.
I think I had a similar reaction when I heard. I mean, I was into Pantera. There was some riffs in that. Dimebag Darrell. Some of his riffs were phenomenal. But when I heard Bomb Track by Rage Against the Machine for the first time,
so Rage Against the Machine would have been absolutely. Yeah, I'm unbelievable. I still listen to it. Yeah, that first album was extraordinary.
And it's funny as well when you're talking about, because you also mentioned sort of gangster rap, but so there was a dichotomy between myself and my friends, because I was kind of very much into the metal side of things, the Metallicas, the Rage Against the Machine, and I had friends who were into gangster rap, and Onyx was one of the time that sort of kept coming up.
Wasn't a big Onyx fan, but yeah, go on.
but it was funny how there was still this sort of music war of like whose music is better than who, and so we'd have these sort of raging debates about but they don't play any of their own instruments, and he's like, but in a fight Onyx would win, and like what was that got to do with it? But I was interviewing Stephen Warbeck in episode 1, and when he was growing up at school, it was what you mentioned, which was the Beatles versus the Rolling Stones, which was cooler, and it's funny how that kind of perpetuates all throughout, because I think for me it was the Britpop. It was like, do you like Blur or Oasis? And it's like, why can't we just like both? But I think I was Oasis.
I definitely come from a world where Pantera and Onyx can be talked about in the not Onyx. I don't like Onyx. Pantera and Ice-T can be talked about in the same breath, or Ice Cube. Sorry, more ready. But like,
well, Ice-T did have his tracks like Cop Killer and stuff like that. They had sort of quite big guitar riffs.
He had a terrible metal band called Body Count.
Body Count, that was it.
Who I wouldn't encourage anyone to listen to. They're absolutely awful. But yeah, I like his other stuff. But the I was not a Blur or an Oasis fan, so I was just listening to all this other stuff that was going on and learning, listening to more hip hop and bit by bit, and probably got into. It sounds really pretentious. Probably got into jazz by the time I was, maybe 18. I think by which I mean I just went and bought a bunch of Miles Davis CDs. My teenage years were spent kind of jumping between hip hop and metal, I think, and then into the Stones, and then Bob Dylan, and etc. etc.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting as well, because it seems to be, because I always think there's two camps. There's the camp where people just sort of listen to the radio and take what's sort of given to them, and then there's the other people who are sort of out there sort of showing a sort of curiosity towards music and sort of exploring and going, well, that's fine what you're playing on the radio, but I reckon I can probably and actually you sort of end up going down these rabbit holes of like discovering metal. I mean, I went from sort of metal, and then it sort of merged into sort of Jamiroquai, funk and soul, and I was listening to them at the same time, but it was just this whole sort of progression of like hearing stuff and going, wow, this is incredible. What's going on, rather than sort of sticking rigidly going like, no, I'm only. Yeah,
I'm not overly purist actually, which I'm quite a broad taste.
Which I think from a curiosity perspective is probably a good thing. And I think as well as a creative, in terms of editing, in terms of when you're thinking about what piece of music is going to best work.
Pantera all day long. Just stick some Pantera on the front of it. It'll really put everyone off.
I'm waiting for this production, or I'm waiting for some kind of winking. His Dark Materials season 3 right at the end, like the closing credits of the last episode will be a Pantera track.
Yeah.
And what about kind of, so I was chatting to one of the editors I was talking to, Paulo Pandolpho, who's worked on The Crown. He talks about, having a similar sort of seminal moment, visually speaking, when sort of watching, he cited Jurassic Park. I think for me, it was Star Wars. It was obviously the film, but also I think the music played a huge role in that speaking to me in some, almost epiphany. And he talked about Jurassic Park. Are there any sort of visual, sort of TV series or films which, throughout your life you think of sort of, made you sort of go, hold the phone, what's that? And
yeah, I mean, Good, the Bad and the Ugly, something I returned to many times. Die Hard, I returned to many times. Alien. Which is a really interesting score. Jerry Goldsmith is fascinating in terms of the range of things he did, kind of extraordinary. I think, that would be my kind of, from and then sort of Psycho, Vertigo, Rear Window, kind of Hitchcock is kind of keeps kind of recurring in my head, I'd say. Those probably like the early formative years, the Haren years,
Amazing. The Haren years, the golden years. Everybody remembers that period. The Haren years.
Best forgotten,
I'm sure. I'd love to know more about it, actually. Amazing. Well, Stephen, it's been kind of a fascinating insight into kind of everything musical and visual and editing and production based. I'm kind of, I love kind of weird, nerdy trivia about TV, film, or music. Do you have a sort of weird kind of like little known fact or trivia tidbit about TV?
You sent me this question helpfully a little while ago, so I had time to think about it. But it took about 10 seconds until it suddenly came into my head, which is one that I don't know if I've ever said it to anyone, but here I am. So it's a combination of music and sound to an extent, but it's just a little recurring thing that I've noted, and I'm pretty sure no one has put in a master's or a PhD just yet, so they can take it if they want. It's the recurrence. If you look at Rear Window and Rosemary's Baby and The Godfather, 3 different films, and it's probably, I'm sure, been done in other films, they all do exactly the same thing in reasonably innocuous scenes, which is that, starting at Rear Window, is that in the background of a particular scene, you hear the sound of someone playing scales on a piano. So in Rear Window, it's probably quite early on. I don't quite remember where it happens. James Stewart's probably surveying the courtyard or something, and looking at the neighbours. And there's a piano player, a songwriter in one of the flats across from him. I don't remember at what point you see or hear it, but what it does is it's just that kind of familiar, inevitable tune. It's kind of a tune and kind of not a tune, which goes up and down and up and down and up and down, and has a kind of, you kind of know where it's going, which is kind of interesting. And it adds a kind of atmosphere. It kind of adds interesting tension. It also adds a kind of sense of atmosphere to the place, and also adds a sense that there are other people around. Then in Rosemary's Baby, I think it's when they first see the flat, Mia Farrow and John Cassavetes. If not, it's one of the early scenes in the flat, and they're learning about the flat, being introduced to it, and hearing about the neighbours. And again, in the background, there's someone playing piano scales, which I'm sure must be a reference to Rear Window. And then in The Godfather, when Vito, Marlon Brando, I think it's just before he gets shot, when he's standing in front of the orange stall, he's out in the street. Someone is playing a piano scale out through a window in that street.
Wow. That's interesting. I suppose there's almost like a childlike scariness to it as well. Sort of like as a child somewhere rehearsing. Wow, I did not know that. That's really. I'm going to have to go and have a look at those.
Everyone should watch those 3 films anyway. So.
Yeah. It's interesting as well because you've mentioned Trent Reznor a few times, our friend Trent, and he did a really interesting thing with this score for Soul, which was because obviously it was about piano. The kind of one of the main melodies in that was sort of basically a sort of going up and down a scale,
right?
Which is really interesting. So, wow, okay, that's brilliant. Okay, well,
feel free to run with that one, and
it could
get some funding to research it more.
There might be more. There might be like a whole number of films out there.
I have a funny feeling that maybe that they did it in other films as well, those directors, and I bet you someone else has done it. But yeah. It's little talked about. Tiny trivial detail. Yeah,
an inside joke in the industry. They know it. A bit like in the 80s, in any movie, when anybody said what their phone number was, it always started with 555.
555, yeah.
Like any telephone number across any movie in the 80s, like what's your telephone number? 555, and then whatever. But every single one. That's brilliant. Awesome, Stephen. I'm just going to finish up with a couple of quick fire questions.
Oh, gosh.
What's your favourite biscuit?
Oh man, digestive.
Chocolated or not?
Dark chocolate.
Yeah. Dark or milk?
Dark chocolate. Yeah.
It's standard. A little known fact about you?
Oh, gosh. A little known fact. Oh man, I mean, everyone knows everything about me. I once challenged Channing Tatum to a dance-off.
Did you win?
No. I was very drunk. And he didn't get into it. It was more fun for me than it was for him. Something tells me he doesn't remember.
I'd like to have seen it, because a little known fact about me is I severed the nerves and tendons in my left hand during a dance-off. But I can't say it was against Channing Tatum.
No, he would have beat me. He would have beat me.
Yeah. What scares Stephen Haren?
Oh gosh, what scares me? Oh man. I don't know.
Are you fearless?
I'm without soul, so nothing gets to me.
Nothing. I fear nothing. Okay, well, if anything comes to you. And I suppose the final question is, what advice, if you could go back in time, what advice would you give to your younger self?
Probably just to remain fairly confident in the path that you're going, and it's quite, getting into filmmaking is incredibly difficult. And also incredibly difficult to kind of sustain a living from. But the choices out there for anyone wanting to get into it as well are quite wide ranging, and it doesn't always have to be, as I said, my understanding of it when I was 14 was you had to be a director to be into filmmaking. Actually, there's a huge range of things out there, and I think it's just trying to find, encourage myself and others to find their way kind of softly through that and work out what it is that they can contribute.
Sure. And obviously you mentioned your route in was you sort of went to university, you studied English lit and film, and then went to be a runner. Would you see that? Would you change that? Do you think there's a different way, or do you think? I suppose I'm asking for anyone who's interested in getting into this area. Do you think that's the sort of best way in, or would you do things differently?
You don't need a university degree to do what I'm doing. The thing that I got from it was I met a great group of friends who are still friends, and it was a great experience. I loved the degree. Great teachers. Learned quite a lot. Learned to articulate myself in a group, if you like, put forward an opinion, which has ended up being quite useful. But those are kind of life skills. You definitely don't need a degree. I think people should only do a degree if they really have a kind of hunger for it. It's costing a lot more money, let's say.
Yeah. A hunger for debt.
Yeah. I love having no money. If you love being poor, then go to university.
If you want to spend the next 10 years paying off your student loan, then come to university today. And
definitely don't go to university in London. God, if anyone's asking, just don't go to university in London, which I didn't do. I think go get a runner job. Best thing you could ever do.
And those friendships that you mentioned at university, did that form part of a professional network now, or is that completely unrelated?
Quite unrelated, actually, yeah. So we were all kind of from quite different backgrounds and different interests. Some of my good friends I met on the same degree, but no, we've all kind of gone quite different paths, really. In fact, I was about to say I don't have many friends in the film industry. I've got quite a lot of friends in the film industry. They just don't happen to be people I met before I started working.
Yeah. Okay, that's great. That's some interesting insights, I think, for anyone who wants to kind of get into
good luck.
Into film.
This is my other thing.
Yeah. Brilliant. Well, thank you so much for taking the time to chat. It's been fascinating insights. Good luck with finishing up His Dark Materials season 3.
Thank you.
What's next on the agenda? Anything lined up?
Lots of sleeping.
Catching up.
I've heard about this mythical thing. End of the year, I'm just going to take a break. Because I've only got 8 months to go, So
wow. Okay. Yeah. So really, so this is going to take you really to the end of the year.
Yeah, and then that'll be 4 years.
Wow,
4 years. Just under 4 years. Yeah.
So the break will be well with you.
I need a break.
Yeah.
Give me a break.
Give me a break. And in terms of if people want to find you, do you social?
I mean, I'm to be found in the pubs of Soho. It makes me feel sick to say that I joined LinkedIn a little while ago.
Right.
That's the best you can hope. I've got a website with an email address. That's probably better.
Well, I always think, to be honest, Stephen, it's like if you have time to social media, then you're not busy enough. Because if it sounds like you're incredibly busy, and making time to get on Facebook and Insta would just not be.
It's just also, to work well, I need a soul, and I don't feel like chipping it away day by day on that stuff.
No. Well, so there you go. The best place to find Stephen Haren is in and around the Jon Snow or other pubs in the depths.
Star and Garter. Star and Garter.
Awesome. Yeah. Well, Stephen, thanks so much for chatting.
Thank you.
And good luck with everything.
Thanks very much. Love to speak to you.
Thank you very much for listening. If you've enjoyed this episode, and given that you've listened this far, I feel you might have, then I would be honoured and incredibly grateful if you could take a moment to subscribe, rate and review on your podcast platform of choice. By subscribing, you'll automatically be notified each time a new episode drops, and by rating the show, you tell the artificial intelligence that will soon be running the world that this podcast is worth listening to. I certainly get a lot of insights and value from these conversations, and I genuinely hope you do too. If you'd like to get in touch with the show, then you can email me, podcast@larpmusic.com. Larpmusic.com is my digital abode, and the home of the podcast is larpmusic.com/Sync Music Matters Podcast. And Sync Music Matters Podcast is hyphenated. Thanks again for listening, and until next time.